All right, welcome everyone to this week's Xojo webinar. This week we got a lighter topic for our webinar, so it probably will not take the entire time, so that'll leave plenty of room for questions if there are questions. But this week we're going to be talking about namespaces in Xojo. So let's open up Xojo right here. And create a new project. So first of all, if you're not familiar with the term namespace, you can essentially think of it as a module. As a namespace in Xojo is added by adding a module to your project. So you can do that right in the insert menu. There's the module entry here. And you can give your namespace a name. So you can call it whatever you like. So say you want to put in a bunch of classes that are specific to your company and you want to keep them nicely collected and isolated from the rest of your project, and maybe even make it a little easier for them to be reused because they'll all be grouped in this manner. So here I created a module called it Acme. And right now it looks like a normal module. You could just add methods, properties, whatever you want to it and use it however. But you can add things to the module. So the module becomes a container of sorts, which makes it the namespace. So some of the things you can add to a module include classes. You can also add other modules. There are certain things you cannot add to a module, however. That includes things like windows, web pages can't be added to a module, containers, menus. Pretty much if it needs to be a class or some sort of subclass in order to be in the module or another module, you can certainly have them nested, and we'll look at some examples for that. So you can see here when I've added the class to the module, it shows up in the classes area here. And now I, of course, can have multiple classes in there. Doesn't really matter. You know, you set it up just like you would, you know, give it a name. You can also control the scope of the specific class. So if it's a public class, it's going to be accessible throughout your project using the namespace. And if it's private, it's only going to be accessible within the module itself, essentially. So it's like a supporting class that's only used by the module, and you don't want anyone outside of the module to be accessing it. And then, of course, with the class, you can then add whatever you want to the class. So you can have your own modules, your own properties, just like as before. I mean, this is still just a class, so you can set it up just as you normally would. But some of the differences with stuff, once it's in a namespace, is how you access it. So you can see I've got all this structure set up here, starting to have an organization of things. I get a couple classes, class has some methods and whatnot. And it's all contained within the module, so I can just close it and everything kind of goes away. So almost like a folder in that sense, but this stuff does have, the scoping capabilities are more precise than a folder, and how you access it also becomes more precise. So if I go to something that's outside of the module, and I want to access something that is in the module. Say I want to create a new instance of calculator. Now you could type it like this, but you can see here when I did a little check for errors thing, I got an error down here at the bottom. It doesn't find the type for calculator because that's not actually the type name. It's not the name of the class because it is in the namespace. And you can see the help message here is attempting to give you a little guidance, and it's asking, did you actually mean acme.calculator? Well, yes, actually, that is what I meant. I meant to use acme.calculator. So you can get rid of the compile error by using the full name. So you could type it like this. So now the error has gone away and only the unused warning appears. And if you wanted to access a method on it, I think we put a method on this one. Let's expand this here. Yes, we put the test method. You could access it the same way you would any other thing once you have the instance. So since I have the instance C, I can then call its methods and use its properties or whatnot, because the namespace name is no longer relevant because I have a local variable containing the instance. Now, if this were a shared property, I would need to use the appropriate name, of course. Now, if you have a lot of stuff in your namespaces, you might not want to have all your code have all this extra typing where you're having to include the name of the namespace every time you want to access stuff that's in it. So you can get away from that by taking advantage of a new command to Xojo 2014 release 3. Hang on, I got a wire in the way. All right. And it's called the using command. So if I know I want to have access to everything that's in a specific namespace, I can use the using command and say, hey, just include everything that's in that namespace. Make it available immediately without me having to prefix it all the time. Can't type. I'm going to do autocomplete then since I can't type. All right, so now I can type this and just use the name calculator. And you can see I don't get an error message. I don't have the prefix, but I don't have an error message. And that's because of the using statement that's up here. I can still include the prefix if I want, because that is the actual name of it, and that's the precise name of it, and it'll obviously still work. So if you had older code or something, it wouldn't break by you sticking the using statement at the top. It would still continue to work. But this allows you to simplify your code by just including the using command right at the top. Now, the using command does have scope rules within your code, so you could use it within if-then statements. So you can see, looking at this command, or this code, the using statement is within the if-then. So it goes out of scope over here. So we should get a compile error on this line here for C2, but not one here on C1, or on C as it is. And as you can see, the using command is out of scope. It doesn't take effect for the whole method, so it's not going to work here. And that may be some way that you want to organize your code, but that is just one particular rule of the using command. And you can also have multiple ones. So if you have multiple namespaces that you want to use in this manner, you can have different ones. So we could add another module. And go back to our code here. We could put second using statement just like that. And that would make available anything that's within the utility namespace to be accessible within this particular method. Now, there may be cases where you want to use the entire, you want to make the entire namespace contents available to an entire window or class or another class or something, an entire project item, rather, because right now these are just specific on the particular method. If I write another method, I'd need to put this line at the top if I wanted to take advantage of it. So what we can instead do is add the using statement to the entire project item. So you can do that here by adding a using clause, and this again is new. And when you add that, you just get a special area here where you can type the name of the namespace you want to include. And that adds all the using clauses here. You can see them in the navigator. And now this line of code here, which as we saw before, gave a compilation error in the past, no longer does, because the using statement is applying to the entire window. It's applied to the entire window. So now any code that we put on this window, any code that we would use in parameter lists, now no longer needs to specify the entire namespace. It only needs to specify the specific class that's in it. All right, now you can nest modules. I don't know if people have done that in the past, but you can nest modules and essentially create a nested namespace, if you will. So I could, let's leave that one like that. Let's add another one in here. So I can add a module in here. So now within the Acme namespace, I've created what will be another namespace, and I'm calling it business logic. And in here, I can add new classes. And name them however I want and whatnot. So now I have a little bit of nesting going here. I have Acme as the main namespace, and within it, I have business logic. So if I want to create an instance of CalcTax, the CalcTax class that I have here, again, I could try and do it like that, but I'm going to get an error. And the error is because, again, it doesn't know exactly how to find that. It knows about Acme, as we gave it access to the Acme namespace. And Acme does include the business logic namespace, but we didn't specifically include the business logic namespace. So right now, we can't just refer to this as CalcTax. What we could refer to it as is the full name. So we could do it like that. Alternatively, we could leave off the Acme part at the beginning because we have the entire window, including the Acme namespace already. So we could leave that part off. And that still works as well. And of course, if you didn't want to even write the business logic part, you can write a using statement like that. And eventually you're down to just using the class name like you are used to with stuff that's global. All right, so that is kind of the structure of how namespaces work. And essentially they're using modules as containers for other classes. Now, I briefly touched on the scoping, and that is still, you want to remember that any classes you don't want to expose to people outside of the namespace, you can set to private. And they show up with the same indicator that you normally have set up, either a dot or the bar. And that means that you wouldn't be able to access that class outside of the namespace. So if I tried to do something here like it won't be able to find it. Actually, it's given an error here, but it probably ought to have a clear error that says it's not available. But the important thing is you don't want people to be able to access it. So that's how you can control that. Now, why would you use namespaces? I mean, after all, you don't technically need to use namespaces. You can continue to just have your classes be global in your project. Put them in folders if you want to use organization. There's no real reason to use a namespace, but it does provide your project with some clearer organization that can be really helpful when projects start to get large. And another thing that they are really handy with is they help to keep your code from bumping into other code. So for example, if if you put all of your custom stuff in your own namespace, and then you go to purchase a third-party product, or you use some open source code, or you want to use some open source code that maybe is not using namespaces, well, there's a possibility that you may both use the same name for a class or something. And then you're going to run into an issue because, well, which one do you use? If you both have a class called utility or calculator or something like that, someone's going to have to change their class name. And if you're using code that you don't necessarily have the ability to change or understand well enough to change, then you're going to have to change your code. And either way, that starts to become a pain. But if everything's within a namespace, that kind of goes away, because your code is now all completely independent within a namespace like this, for example, Acme. And the class name being part of the namespace no longer is going to bump into each other. So if you both have a class called calculator that's in a namespace, they're different classes. The full namespace path will identify them as different classes, so they won't step on each other. So it certainly, again, helps when you have multiple things that you want to use in that manner. And again, it provides a nice grouping, really, just to have everything like that in one block of code, if you will, that you can easily grab, copy to another project, have available in the project, and then just use, knowing that it's safe code. It's not going to step on anything else and cause any other strange little bugs where you're using one class and you thought you were using a different one. So it's pretty neat stuff. Namespace has been around in Xojo for actually quite a while, many years. I don't even remember exactly when it was added, but it's been in there many years. And probably not really a heavily used feature. But I bring it up again now because I talked about it a little bit last month in the Xojo framework webinar, because starting in the Xojo framework, Xojo itself is making some use of namespaces. And in particular, I'm going to revisit that a little bit here. So here you can see the Xojo framework. Now, the full framework, of course, has been mentioned before, is available only in iOS projects at the moment. But part of it is available for all project types, and more will be available for all project types over time. So right now, the core namespace is what is available on all project types. And you can see how this is organized. It starts to have all the particular classes grouped in some logical manner, rather than everything just being globally available throughout the application. So now you have more of an idea of where you might want to start looking for things. Helpful with autocomplete, helpful just when you're looking for things and you maybe don't remember the exact name that it might be called. You can at least start to think, all right, this is a basic functionality. I'll probably check in the core namespace first, see if I find what I'm looking for. Or, on the iOS side, same sort of thing. Well, I need to do some file I/O. I probably should check the I/O namespace. Is that class called folder item? Is it called system file? What is it called? I don't remember. So it provides some grouping there. And it's particularly helpful as more and more classes start adding to a framework to have some sort of organization like this. And you can see pretty much how this is probably implemented in Xojo behind the scenes. There's a Xojo namespace, or a module, and within it is another module called core. And within that, it has classes for each of these things that you have available for your use. So if you needed to add a class to your project that stepped on one of the names that was in a Xojo namespace, that was a Xojo namespace class, you could still use that name, but just put it in your own namespace, and it becomes isolated and independent, and it doesn't bump into the built-in stuff that's included with Xojo. So it essentially gives everyone their own little playground for their stuff that won't conflict with anyone else's stuff, should you, try to share your toys with others. if you will. And one other command that is not used a lot, but is somewhat related to namespaces. Here is in the command area, and it's the global keyword. And there's a bit of a contrived example here that shows you how this might be useful. But essentially, sometimes you can set up a situation where you might have something that's global class or whatever. But because maybe it's using a common name, a namespace or something else takes over that name because of a using statement. But there may be a time where you actually want to access the real global one. That becomes more difficult if you've implemented a using statement. And a good example of that, you can look at the kind of the fake example here, but I mean, if you take that on an example here of this particular thing, I have my calculator class in here. Well, if I also added a global calculator class, not that this is generally, a great design. You might, if it's your own stuff, you probably would want to avoid accidentally doing something like this, but sometimes it happens and there's not great ways around it. So I now have two classes that essentially are called calculator in my project. One is in a namespace and one is not. So this is the global calculator and this is the acme.calculator. And if I'm in some code here, you might ask, well, which calculator am I getting when I declare this instance? Am I getting the global one or am I getting the namespace one? Well, in this particular case, because of the using clause being in place, you're going to get the namespace one. So it'll do a lookup from the inner one, the most restrictive one, and then it'll do an outer lookup. So it's going to find the inner one first, and it's going to say, all right, I'm going to give you an instance of this guy right here. But if you actually do end up needing an instance of the outer one, you still can now by doing it like this and saying, no, I actually want the global, I want to access what essentially is the global namespace. So essentially stuff that's not in any namespace. And I want to access calculator that's sitting on that. And that'll give you this one right here. Like I said, this is a very specialized thing. You're not likely to need it, if ever. But if you do run into a situation where you end up having a design in a project where you kind of almost box yourself in, you can do this sort of thing. Of course, the alternative is to get rid of the using statement and just use the full acme.calculator here, and then just use calculator here. That also would work. So you just want to make sure you have access to the particular things that you obviously want to use. Let's see here. I got a question from Roger asking, can we add a using clause using Xojo.core to a window? Yeah, sure. You could add a using clause here. And then you can access stuff that's sitting in the Xojo core namespace. I don't actually have some of these memorized, but this one has a current is what I was looking for. Then you can write code like that. And you can you may have noticed when you're creating iOS projects, you generally don't have to worry about the namespaces. You're able to just use these classes by their class name. You don't have to add any of the prefixes for the namespaces when you're in an iOS project. And that's because we're essentially doing this sort of thing for you automatically behind the scenes. So if you look at an iOS project, you can see here on the shared settings, there's an option right here called Simple References. And it's always on by default. And this is what essentially enables simple access to all the class names. So it does a using for all the Xojo core namespace stuff, so that you can just use it by its simple class name. You could of course turn that off if you wanted, but I think leaving it on is pretty handy for most people, so they're probably going to want to go with that. Then the other thing to keep in mind, though, is if you do want to share code between iOS and web or desktop projects, iOS stuff can only use the code that's in the Xojo namespace, or the classes that are in the Xojo namespace. But desktop and web projects, and console for that matter, can use stuff that's been, the stuff that's existed for the last 15 plus years, and can use the stuff that's in Xojo.core. So if you want to create shareable code, you either have to limit the code you're sharing to just the Xojo.core classes, or you need to isolate it using conditional compilation, so that if the code is included in an iOS project, it uses the appropriate classes, and if it's not, it uses also what it has accessible. And you can do that sort of thing. This would be the compilation statement for checking if something is running on iOS, and then here you'd be able to use whatever you want, and then here you could do an else and assume that, well, that's everything else, and locale is not directly available, so I'd have to write, or I could put the using statement right here. So lots of flexibility there, but you do have to remember to be at least a little cognizant of that and thinking about it if you are intending to create code that you want to share across projects like that. And I do want to point out to people who are thinking or who are doing iOS stuff and concerned about what is available and what isn't available. Certainly, whatever you see in the iOS framework for controls and iOS specific stuff is obviously available. And then anything that's in this Xojo area is available. And this is all from a class standpoint. From a Xojo language standpoint, everything from a language standpoint is always available in iOS. So that includes, all your regular commands, if then else, whatever that you're used to, all the operators, all that sort of things. And still don't have everything yet here in the docs, but I'm starting to get most of it. Add a few each day, and eventually they'll all be there. So you can see the reserved words are all noted here, and these are all going to be available in all project types because they're built into the Xojo language. And more and more pages are starting to appear here that you can read on how to use, but they don't work any differently in iOS than they would in any of the project types. So if it's a language command, not a class or something like that, you can definitely use it in your iOS projects and of course across projects if you're trying to make code like that. All right, let me just check my notes here. Like I said, this is going to be a shorter webinar because I just wanted to cover this namespace feature, which is not necessarily new, but probably new to a lot of people who haven't thought about it much or spent much time with it. And I wanted to make sure people understood how it works, maybe had a way to take advantage of it in their projects, and understand how it's also going to be used in the new Xojo framework throughout the updates to Xojo from now on, I suppose. So since we have a little extra time, I'm certainly open to questions. I don't see any that are pending, but I mean, if you have questions on this topic or anything that you think I might be able to answer, I'm happy to read the questions and then possibly answer them for you. So If you have something that you think I might be able to help answer, feel free to post it in the little question window. And while I wait, see if there are any questions, I'll point out, seems like each week I can point out the doc site here because there's always something new for people to check out. In particular, as I was mentioned here in the reference guide, the language section has been getting a lot of stuff added to it the last few weeks. A lot of the commands are being added, and you'll be able to click on those and see information about them. These are often rewritten or cleared up based on what has been in the wiki for many, many years. The examples are cleared up to make better use of the new Xojo framework, that sort of thing. But the big good reason to get this stuff in here is because it all searches much better. So you can now use the search field up here and start to get better results that will help you find what you're looking for. And also along that end, there's also some, at least on the online version, there's some links that have been added down here at the bottom. Of course, all the videos that are done here as webinars are popping into the video section once they're processed and posted on YouTube. So you can always click here to be able to read a little bit about what the webinar was about, download any related project, and then play it on YouTube. For some reason, the preview always looks a little fuzzy, but when it plays, it looks normal. And that'll continue to be added with stuff that I expect I'll be categorizing them. We've done, at this point, it's got to be about 60 of these, maybe more. And so I don't just want to have a giant list of 60 things, but getting them all in here will, again, make them much easier to search and will allow me to link relevant videos to particular topics. So if you're reading about a particular class or commands and I've done a webinar on that, I can have links to that will drive you right to it so you can watch a video on it. And there are also some external links down here at the bottom that will take you to the current PDF versions of the user guide and fun areas such as forums, blog, articles on our website, the wiki that has all the classic framework stuff documented, and other useful links. All right, I got a couple questions here. So let's see here. Roger is asking something about a previous webinar. It looks like I was closing the iOS simulator from the Windows top bar. I have not found that secret. How is that done? Not exactly sure, but let's see here. This, yeah, this is the iOS project. See, to close the simulator, there's essentially two ways that you can do that. So when the simulator boots up and runs your little app, I mean, the most common way is just to quit the entire simulator. When you do that, I just press Command Q and that quits the simulator, or quit from up here. And when you do that, the debugger knows that the simulator was quit, so it is immediately able to take you back to what you were working on. The downside of doing that is that each time you press Command R, you have to wait for this simulator to do its little boot, which I don't really know why it takes longer sometimes than it does other times, but it seems to. Nonetheless, that could get annoying. So the alternative is you just close the window for it. And, there could have sworn there was a button up here for the usual close stuff. I guess the taken to the home button. I guess not. So the other way to do it is if the thing is running, rather than closing the simulator this way, you can just go to the debugger and press the stop button. And when you do that, your app is closed in the simulator. And if I go to rerun it, the simulator doesn't have to start back up, so the app launches much more quickly. So I know some people prefer to do that just because, people don't like to wait. and that is quite a bit quicker. So it all depends what you're used to. You know, if you're comfortable with, you know, if it's a kind of a reflex, and it kind of is a reflex for me to just Command Q when I'm done testing a desktop app. I often will Command Q when I'm done testing the iOS app. And then sometimes I do get annoyed because then I'm like, oh, darn, I'm going to have to wait for that thing to start back up again. So if you don't want to wait, use the debugger stop button to kill the app, and then it'll launch a little bit quicker. So hopefully, Roger, that addresses what maybe you were asking. All right, and another question here from Kato is asking about external namespaces like using ActiveX or DLLs. Well, those wouldn't really be namespaces. Those are more of external objects. And to connect to things like DLLs, you use the declare statement in Xojo, which coincidentally I'm going to be covering in next week's webinar. Specifically, I was going to be covering creating some declare statements for iOS stuff, but I might be able to squeeze in how you might do a declare statement to a Windows API, system API as well. I'll make a note to see if that's something I'll be able to squeeze in. And the same thing applies to ActiveX, except you're not going to use a declare statement to connect to something with ActiveX. You actually have to pick the ActiveX control. I can't do it from the OS X IDE. But if I remember, I think on the Windows IDE, there's an entry up here that says insert or add ActiveX control or something like that. And then when you pick that, you get the standard Windows ActiveX control list. I think it shows COM objects and ActiveX objects. And then you're able to just choose something from there. And that kind of populates it in Xojo for you to use. Not all of those things necessarily work with Xojo, but a few do. And there's at least one example in the, there might even be two, in the user guide. You can, I think it's book 4 of the user guide, has a couple examples of that. And it shows you how to use like the Adobe PDF or Adobe Reader ActiveX to actually display a PDF within your app. And I think there's another example that shows you how to use the Internet Explorer ActiveX to display a website within the app rather than relying on the HTML viewer or something like that. All right, just scanning the new contents here to see if there's anything else in particular I wanted to point out. Well, I have it all up. And it's right now I'm not adding a lot of new content. It's more of moving over existing content to make it more searchable and then cleaning stuff up so it better fits with the new framework and the new data types and that sort of thing. But it is very handy to be able to search in one place and have all your stuff come up. I know right now the existing PDF user guides are broken into 4 books, each a separate PDF file, and people have told me it kind of is a pain to search that because you got to go to each book and search. And once all the content is moved over here from the language standpoint, I will begin moving the user guides over to here as well to have it in its own section so that it is also going to be searchable from the single search field here and also linkable so that language reference topics will be able to point you to perhaps more detail that's in the user guide and vice versa. So hopefully we'll be reaching a point some point this year where all this stuff is very easy to search, very easy to find, and nicely linked together so that once you do find one thing, you can continue to learn more about it and become an expert. And then I'll be able to contact you and invite you to do guest webinars, whoever you may be. I don't see any more questions on the queue at the moment. And not too bad for time. A little shorter than usual, like I mentioned. Next week, I'm going to be covering declares. and set your expectations accordingly. I'm no declare expert, but I can write a few. I've written a few in my day, and we're going to go through a couple iOS ones, and we'll go through right from scratch. So looking at something, thinking of something we want to add, searching the Apple Docs to find if it's an option, and then deciphering the Apple Docs to figure out how we might convert that to a declare that we can then use in Xojo to give us the feature we want. So that should be fun, be a little more in-depth than this one. So rest before and be ready. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Certainly, if you have webinar topics or suggestions, by all means, get them to me. And have a great day.